The number of people actually dedicated to coming up with stories is critical, isn't it?
Well, yeah, there's a huge misunderstanding right now. There's a belief that, you know, the newspapers are going to fail, so what? What most people don't realize is what a critical part of the news food chain newspapers and print really have been. It isn't the physical newspaper that matters so much as the content that it represents. The local coverage that could be lost in the next 10 years if there are no policy changes, if there's no new model for revenue, is really kind of frightening. And I would go so far, and I know it sounds cliche, but I think democracy itself would be very much at risk if you have a culture where people literally won't know what's going on. You know, they'll get entertainment news, they might get national news, they'll get some of the things that they can get, but they may literally know nothing about their local community.
Now, back in the 70s, the government introduced the Newspaper Preservation Act as one way to deal with failing papers at that time. Could you talk about that act and what it was able to accomplish?
Well, the act certainly, it allowed for joint operating agreements, so you could get two newsrooms that could basically operate separately, put out two separate products, but they would have one business entity. So all their advertising and all the commercial side was commingled, co-joined. The problem with it was it really was perhaps, it did preserve some products like the Rocky, it preserved the Seattle PI for a period of time, but it still didn't, it didn't solve the problem, and it did in some cases, it still let the owners believe that they had a monopoly on a market when it came to ad rates and things like that. So maybe it forestalled the problem, and then of course the web came along and changed all the dynamics.
Laura Frank, you wanted to get a word in there.
Yeah, I just wanted to say I think that Bernie makes a good point, and I want to tell you about an experience that we had several times over the past 2 months. You know, Scripps announced December 4th that the Rocky Mountain News was for sale, and everyone knew right away that that would likely mean, in this atmosphere, closure. And we would get letters and calls and emails and comments on our website saying, gosh, it's terrible that the newspaper may go away, but don't worry, we'll keep reading you on the web. I think a lot of consumers of news on the web don't realize where that information is coming from. And the way that news tends to work in this country is that it surfaces at the level of local newspapers and sort of percolates its way up. And so to get information to the masses, we really depend on those local, in most cases, those local newspapers. So we've not seen before in this democracy what is happening today.
And Laura, even the papers that are surviving with fewer actual reporters who go out there and get the news, and more of the people now, I know that in many daily newspapers now, it's the websites are the only ones that are growing. The people who design the websites, who regurgitate the news that they found someplace else. So even those that are still around, the actual number of people who go out in the streets to gather the news is declining rapidly, isn't it?
You know, on the week before the Rocky closed, I did a quick survey, and in Denver, in the last 2 years alone, there had been at least 25 investigative reporters, editors, and producers who were no longer working, no longer with eyes and out there watching out for what was going on. With the closure of the Rocky, you can add, you know, at least 10 or 12 more classic investigative reporters to that list. But if you look at the overall number of reporters that have been lost in this city in the past couple of years, you're probably looking in the hundreds. And that is not something that's been happening over several years. It's not something that happened just last week with the closure of the Rocky. You're right, it's something that's been happening across the country in incremental ways over the past 10 years.
Who will hold the government accountable, Laura Frank?
Well, we still have one newspaper. We still have some TV stations. We have citizen journalists. And we hopefully soon have the nonprofit investigative news network that we're working on. We hope some combination of that will continue to hold officials accountable. even the mayor of Denver, at the announcement of the closure of the Rocky Mountain News, said, look, it's not, I'm paraphrasing him, but he said, it's not always pleasant to be the subject of the spotlight of public examination, but it's an important thing. And we all realize that, and we need it to continue to happen. So we're going to have to figure out a new way to work it. But I don't think it's entirely new. I mean, citizens have always been a part of the news as it percolates up, as I said. And so I think that we're going to have to figure out a way to make sure that still happens, and people are paying attention right now. The death of the Rocky Mountain News has gotten attention not only here in Colorado but throughout the nation. And in fact, I did an interview yesterday with multimedia news in Bogota, Colombia. This has really been a wake-up call for people. So I'm hoping that
Bernie Lunzer,
there may be some good that comes out of it.
I'd just like to ask Bernie, we have about 20 seconds left. You were talking about possible new models that involve foundation and for-profit models. Could you quickly give us a quick sense of that?
Well, if you Google the term L3C, you'll see that we're trying to push forth legislation that creates a socially oriented for-profit company that can take nonprofit foundation money. So on that level, we're trying to mix for-profit and nonprofit. We think it's a major change in the LLC structure, and we think it has huge potential for the market.
We want to thank both of you for being with us. Bernie Lunzer, president of the Newspaper Guild, speaking to us from Washington, and Laura Frank, former investigative reporter at the Rocky Mountain News. Her husband also worked at the Rocky Mountain News, which closed last week, would have celebrated its 150th anniversary this next month. That does it for today's broadcast. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Berkshire, for the producer Armando Angela Comet, Steve Martinez, Nicole Salazar, Hadi Massoud, Ravi Karen, Mike DeFilippo, Miguel Noguera, Peter Curries, our engineers. Special thanks also to Nick Gala, Hugh Grant, Samantha Shumbley, Jessel Noor. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez. Thanks for joining us.